Martin Scorsese's kind of like Tarantino when it comes to the 80s, not exactly his favorite era. Back in 2012, Fast Company did this massive 4-hour interview with him, and the whole thing ended up feeling like a film class. Scorsese talked about his career, his fights with studios, all that, but mostly he talked movies. He name-dropped 85 films that mattered to him. And here's the kicker. Out of those 85 movies, only 6 were from the 80s. But these 6, according to Scorsese, these are the best of the best from that decade. This one's by Robert Altman, and it's basically a satire about American politics set at a health food convention down in Florida. You've got this powerful political organization electing a new president, there's vote rigging, shady deals, all that messy stuff. Famous TV talk show hosts Dick Cavett and Dinah Shore pop up in it. But when the movie finally came out, it got pretty much buried. Critics weren't kind. One critic called it an indulgent mess, said it was mournful and frustrating. Even President Ronald Reagan saw it during a screening at Camp David and called it the world's worst movie. Pretty rough. For Scorsese, though, this movie mattered. He picked it as one of his essential 85 films, something you absolutely need to watch if you care about cinema. He saw something deeper there, a kind of sad companion piece to Altman's masterpiece, Nashville. In fact, it came out around the same time as Scorsese's own King of Comedy, and both films bombed hard. Scorsese later said, "The age of the director was over. E.T. had just come out. It changed the entire business. Everything was different after that." Scorsese called this Paul Schrader movie a masterpiece, and Schrader is someone he's worked closely with. Schrader wrote Taxi Driver and Raging Bull for him. This movie is all about the controversial Japanese author Yukio Mishima, whose real-life story is honestly stranger than fiction. Mishima was an acclaimed writer, even considered a likely candidate to win Japan's first Nobel Prize for Literature. But later, he became obsessed with extreme right-wing politics and traditional samurai values, eventually staging a failed coup and taking his own life in a ritual, very publicly, in 1970. After Mishima died, Japan didn't really want to talk about him anymore. He became almost taboo. But Schrader went straight into it. The film premiered at Cannes in 1985, shot entirely in Japan with Japanese actors and crew. Schrader saw Mishima as this complex, deeply tormented figure, the kind of outsider Schrader's always interested in. Scorsese had deep ties to United Artists back in the 70s, and he always said they were great producers, really supportive of directors. But then came Heaven's Gate, Michael Cimino's hugely ambitious Western epic, and it basically burned everything to the ground. Cimino was riding high after The Deer Hunter cleaned up at the Oscars, so United Artists gave him total creative control and a massive $11 million budget for this next film. But Cimino went crazy. He rebuilt entire sets just because they didn't look quite right, physically moved entire trees for better shots, and sometimes demanded up to 50 takes of simple scenes. He shot over 220 hours of film, and by the time he finally finished, the budget ballooned up to $44 million. And what did they get for it? A sprawling, 3-hour and 39-minute epic that critics absolutely destroyed and audiences totally rejected. Box office was a disaster. It only made around $3.5 million. United Artists collapsed from the losses, the same Hollywood that called Cimino a genius after The Deer Hunter turned on him, blaming him personally for wrecking the studio and ending the golden age of New Hollywood. Scorsese always argued that the industry's obsession with box office numbers started after Heaven's Gate. Studios freaked out and clamped down way too hard to avoid another disaster. He said clearly, cinema's been devalued and demeaned, not just from business, but artistically too. Ever since the 80s, there's been this constant obsession with numbers, and it's pretty repulsive. Based on Ron Kovich's own life story, Oliver Stone's Born on the 4th of July has Tom Cruise playing a Vietnam veteran paralyzed in combat, who later becomes an outspoken anti-war activist. Universal Pictures, back when Tom Pollock and Casey Silver ran things, really pushed to make films like this, movies Scorsese called special pictures. And Scorsese really respected what Universal was doing in the 80s. Around that time, he was especially impressed by a young actor named Willem Dafoe, and both Heaven's Gate and Born on the 4th of July feature him. Obviously impressed by his talent, Scorsese eventually cast Dafoe as Jesus in The Last Temptation of Christ. Actually, Scorsese even got to present Oliver Stone with the Best Director Oscar for this movie. Pretty cool moment, considering Scorsese was Stone's former film school teacher. Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing was exactly the kind of bold, risky movie that drew Scorsese to Universal in the first place during Pollock and Silver's era. But things didn't last. Pollock eventually left Universal, and Scorsese says that's when everything changed. Spike Lee premiered Do the Right Thing at Cannes, and audiences loved it. But it ended up losing the Palme d'Or to Soderbergh's Sex, Lies, and Videotape. Spike's actually still annoyed about that one. But the real drama happened when Universal considered releasing the film in America. Studio heads got super nervous, wanted to delay its release from summer, scared of racial tensions flaring up. But Tom Pollock, Universal's president, stood by the film completely. Spike Lee said Pollock easily could have said no, he'd already been through hell with Last Temptation of Christ and got death threats over it. But Pollock stood firm. Spike said Tom Pollock was not scared at all. It came out on the 4th of July weekend, 1989. And despite all those fears, nothing went wrong. Actually, it did great business right from the start, pulled in $3.6 million in its first weekend alone. And it wasn't just in black neighborhoods either. It played equally well everywhere. By the end, it had made about $27 million total. Not bad at all for a film everyone was afraid would cause riots. Scorsese always had huge respect for horror master John Carpenter, and he especially loved Carpenter's They Live, calling it one of the best films of the decade. According to Scorsese, Carpenter is a filmmaker who's unashamed to stay within genres he loves and practices his trade like a master craftsman. At first glance, They Live seems like just another sci-fi flick, but it's really Carpenter's brutal take on Reagan-era America, totally anti-establishment, totally angry. Scorsese compared it to Depression-era classics like Heroes for Sale and Wild Boys of the Road because it shares that same anger and community spirit among people pushed to society's edge. Basically, aliens secretly invade Earth, but nobody notices because they disguise themselves as rich, successful, beautiful people you'd see walking down Rodeo Drive. The aliens broadcast subliminal messages everywhere, controlling the masses, until a pair of special sunglasses reveals the truth. Scorsese especially loved the movie's dark humor and that hilariously endless fight between Roddy Piper and Keith David. He said clearly, "They Live is one of the best films from a fine American director, lyrical, tough, and unusually bitter and sad." Carpenter perfectly captured the outrage of that era.